Welcome to the 180 Minimalist. I'm James, and I will today be guiding you through LG Lesson 1, the Low Deduction Approach. If you've been doing any sort of LG study on your own, something that you've probably come across is what I would call the deductive approach, and that is to say most test prep solutions make a big deal out of deductions or things you can figure out ahead of time about the game. To get more specific about what deductions actually are, it's the methodology where allegedly you can use super ninja LG powers to figure out the entire game before even looking at the first question, by putting together various hints and clues that it gives you before actually looking at questions and answer choices. When you can find them, deductions certainly are powerful, but that's a big if, when you can find them. And this is where we begin to run into problems with the deductive methodology. The problem here is twofold. The first is that most people doing this just aren't fast enough or insightful enough to pull it off in time. That's not a knock on you or anyone in particular. I would put myself in this category as well. It's just how it is. 35 minutes is not a lot of time. This exam in this particular section, I would say, has been intentionally designed by the LSAT to be very difficult to pull off in that amount of time, and deductions really only make it worse for most of us. The second problem, and perhaps more pressing, is that the exam itself seems to have moved away from an explicitly deduction-heavy approach, or another way of putting it is that the games that they put out don't really seem to reward that approach nearly as much as they used to. In particular, in my experience as an instructor, I do distinctly recall a phase right around the late 2000s, early 2010s, maybe 2010 was kind of the turning point, where students began to talk to me about the deductive approach not working. I kind of saw it coming, in a sense, because more and more as I believe we were in the prep test, 70s or early 70s, upper 60s at that point, or maybe it was mid 60s. It's been a while. But even the easiest, simplest ordering situation, for example, you used to be able to figure those out ahead of time. You could actually have a fairly complete picture, or at least like a tree, like an order tree, something like that. But that became much less of a thing right around that time, in my opinion. Of course, there have been shifts back and forth, and the exam could still shift back to a deduction-heavy approach. That's still entirely in the hands of the LSAC. But as of right now, I would argue, and I would feel defensively argue, that we are still in a phase where they are leaning away from rewarding upfront deductions and are instead rewarding your ability to perform under pressure and process information as it is presented to you, rather than trying to do it all ahead of time. So on that basis, I strongly recommend a near-complete abandonment of deductions. Near-complete. Pretty much don't do them. Only take note of deductions that reveal themselves to you with no effort, the lowest of the low-hanging fruit out there. Basically, your standard should be, if it should take effort for you to ignore a particular deduction, then make a note of it, but really put no actual effort into finding ones that do not make themselves obvious to you with no work. So again, the real score maker is not to do deductions, i.e. figure everything out ahead of time, but instead to have a very strong grasp of the rules and to be able to run through all of them quickly and accurately as you assess your work after you've done it. So don't figure things out ahead of time, but instead be more flexible and be able to figure things out as information is provided to you in a sort of steadier stream from the questions and the answer choices. So to demonstrate what my low/no deduction approach looks like, we will be looking at the June 2007 exam. Just a note on that choice, this particular exam has been released in PDF format by the LSAC for many years on their website, and then when they switched to the electronic flex format, I believe this is one of the free exams that they still allow you access to. So it's been out there, people are familiar with it, and you can still find PDF copies of it, I believe, on their website or on the internet in other places. So specifically, we'll be looking at the logic game section, which is section 1 of that exam, and we will be looking at I guess it would be the third game, questions 11 through 17. So let's take a look at that one. Step 1 of the methodology is pretty consistent with pretty much every other test prep methodology that I'm aware of that's out there, but that's just to read the intro paragraph to identify the game type as our first task. Just as a note, I'm not really going to go extensively over each of the individual types. I made these courses and I teach my courses to people who generally have that level of familiarity. Of course, if you don't and you feel a little bit lost, that's fine. At the end of this video here, there will be options to contact me directly and I can help you out a little bit with that. But for this video, I'm not really going to get into the details too much. What we have in this case is an ordering situation, just simply putting things in order. There are 4 destinations, 1 ship, is going to visit all those 4 destinations, but it's going to take, those visits are going to be spread out over the course of 7 weeks. But we are essentially just putting things in order. The second thing that I recommend everybody does in the step 1 phase is to also look for what I call a rule 0. And that's a baseline or fundamental condition that is important to always keep track of, but is not listed discretely and separately as one of the rules. In this case, all I see is that each of the 4 destinations has to appear at least once. That's going to be my rule 0. While this is pretty commonplace, it's still handy to confirm, at least in my experience. Note that not requiring all 4 of the destinations to appear seems to greatly increase our options and the variability in some respects, so having this limitation is nice. Knowing that each of those 4 places, I believe it's G, J, M, and T, that each of those 4 letters has to make at least one appearance kind of helps us out a little bit. It can help us fill in some blanks if we have some extra space left. The third and final thing you might want to do during step 1 is to note anything else you might find useful about the game that doesn't really arise to the level of a rule 0 that you can just sort of write down as a separate rule, but just some general sense of how these games work. You will mostly get this kind of thing through experience, just having seen so many of these during practice. You'll have a sense for what is going on and what kind of interactions might be set up potentially through just the intro paragraph there. But yeah, the things that you notice here are going to be distinct from Rule 0 stuff because it's going to be harder to place them in a nice, concise rule format. And I will show you what that looks like in just a moment here. So in this case, what I'm going to note here is that there are 7 possible slots, but only 4 entities to fill them in with. Since empty slots aren't really going to be a thing, we do have to visit someplace every week. That means we will have some repeats. What that tells me is that chances are there will be rules and interactions that have something to do with those repeats. It might not be a very truly explicit kind of relationship, but at the same time, this interaction that, okay, we've seen GJMT once, but because they can show up again, there may be some interaction that either arises from a rule in general or a particular scenario that we're working on in particular. Either way, hopefully you can see at this point that this sort of information, while perhaps handy, isn't something that you can codify efficiently in a separate quote-unquote Rule 0. So that's why this is sort of in the catch-all step here after the Rule 0 step. So a recap of step 1. The first part of step 1 is to, again, identify what kind of game we're doing. The next part of step 1 is to look for anything that rises to the level of a Rule 0, i.e. a condition about the game that's important for you to keep track of, but is not listed separately as a rule. And finally, there's a catch-all analysis stage where you're looking for things and potential interactions that may arise from the way the game is set up that it's going to be handy to know, but it's also at the same time going to be much more difficult to put it into Rule 0 format. For me, in this case, it was the thing that I noted here was that there are 7 slots but only 4 things to fill them with, so there are going to be repeats. Having finished step 1, we're moving right into step 2, and again, this should be fairly consistent with most other methodologies that are available out there. But the next step that I do is to draw a blank baseline diagram based purely on just what I've read from the intro paragraph and the game type that it is. It may turn out that ultimately we'll need to make some tweaks, but there should be a standard picture that you fall back on for every game type at this point. And for here, since we have an ordering setup and I don't really see anything that makes it particularly special, I'm just going to go with the classic 7 blanks in a row to represent our 7 spots that we need to fill. Of course, there's a variety of diagrams. There's even perhaps arguably 2 different diagrams for ordering situations. But as I mentioned before, I'm really not here today in this video to go over all the different types. Again, if you want more individualized help with that, feel free to contact me with the information provided at the end of this video and in the contact section of my channel. So even though I'm not going to go over the individual types, as I just said, I will give you the priority list, or the hybrid diagram priority list, to be, I guess, kind of formal about it. This applies when the LSAT asks you to do more than just one task within a game. And so if you want to be able to construct a diagram that encapsulates all those tasks at once, this is the procedure to follow. So when you have a hybrid situation, the highest priority, or the first priority for your diagram, should be grouping. Next, if you have ordering, you throw that in there after you have incorporated any grouping tasks. Next in the list is matching. Matching, again, put that in only after you've taken care of both grouping and ordering as part of your diagram. And finally, we have the in and out. In and out, of course, doesn't really have much of a diagram of its own, but you would incorporate that last. only after you've taken care of the other three. So if a hypothetical game has you doing grouping, ordering, and in and out, the first thing you would draw is a grouping diagram, which is usually just a blank table. Next, you incorporate ordering. Maybe you would draw the usual blank lines, like so, into the table cells as needed. And finally, we get to the in and out part. As I said earlier when I was giving you the priority list, in and out doesn't really even have a diagram, but to keep track of it, you'd simply list out all the entities and circle and cross them out as appropriate. Again, I don't really feel like this particular presentation here is the appropriate place to get into a more detailed discussion of this, setting up hybrid situations. I'm just here really to demonstrate the low deduction approach and to show you how that works. So if you do have any questions, feel free to contact me and we can work through some more hybrid situations, because I do know that is a pain point for a lot of people. I just want to make this one final note about hybrid situations. A lot of folks are under the impression that they are more difficult and challenging than a pure game. Now, I would like to challenge that notion and actually tell you, no, not really. They have found ways to make pure ordering games, which is like the bread and butter, the simplest of the four types that we have, right? They have found ways to make those extremely challenging. Whereas a hybrid game, no matter how you cut it, it does have to be done in the same 35-minute time interval that all the other ones have to do. So they can't put like a really hard ordering game mixed into a really hard grouping game with a dash of matching on top of it, and the matching task also being a relatively hard game on its own. They can't do that. In order to make a hybrid game, they have to water down the three individual tasks. And since the way we tend to do things is to sort of split things up by task and kind of take care of one task and then take care of the next task as we have the information for it, what ends up happening is these, if you are orderly about them, these hybrid situations are actually easier. So I just want to leave that thought with you guys in case some of you are struggling for hybrids and you really wish that there was some more material about that here. Truth be told, there is a lot more that can be said. It's going to be highly personal, individual to your particular likes and dislikes and abilities and inabilities, so to speak. So step 3 of the approach, pretty much like everybody else out there, is to begin the rules. I like to list them out as R numbers, so rule 0 is R0, R1, R2, etc. Nothing groundbreaking here. I also like to translate each rule visually, so the information that the rule conveys imitates what that information would look like were I to incorporate it into my diagram. So if a rule says one thing, such as X appears earlier than Y, but your diagram has a specific way of demonstrating that information, i.e., let's say you went with a vertical diagram, where the earliest entity is on the bottom and the latest one is at the top, then your translation would look something like this. Your X would appear at the bottom. You would then place an ellipsis or a dash, whatever you use to symbolize precedence or order of any kind between entities. So here I'm just going to go with a vertical configuration of an ellipsis. And finally, we'd cap it off by writing Y at the top. Again, nothing groundbreaking, nothing you probably haven't seen before, and it's probably something that you're already doing. I just want to make sure we're on the same page when I say something like translate them visually so that the information the rule conveys imitates what it would look like in my diagram. That's what I mean. So for this situation, since I went with a standard left to right ordering setup, with left being earlier and right being later, for me, all the rules look like as follows. Rule 0 starts off the list, all show up at least once. Rule 1, J is not in spot 4. Rule 2, T is permanently assigned to spot 7. Rule 3, there are exactly 2 M's, and the MGM configuration is as follows. Rule 4, if you place a J anywhere, there has to be a G immediately in the blank in front of it. And finally, Rule 5, there are no consecutive letters that show up. In case you're following along and not really pausing, I don't know why you wouldn't be, but I'll give you guys a little bit of a minute to catch up if you're trying to write these down. There is one thing I want to mention here, because there is one low-hanging fruit deduction I got just from drawing out the rules. So R0 tells us that all 4 letters have to appear at least once in our diagram. J, of course, is one of those letters, but again, every time we place J somewhere, according to Rule 4, we have to put G directly in front of it. This guarantees that the GJ block, as I've written out here, appears at least once in every diagram. So it's not really the most impactful deduction out there, but it's another thing in our toolkit for this game. And now, aside from visually translating the rules and getting that one low-hanging deduction out of the way, the only other thing physically left to do here is to incorporate any rules like R2 directly into the base diagram, which you can do just exactly like it sounds. 7 blank dashes, and in the 7th one, drop the T. So that was more like 30 seconds, but you get the point. Moving along to further in step 3, before we depart the rules and move on to the next stage, the last thing I like to note is just to get a sense of how some of the rules might interact. So I just want to note here that my eye is drawn to Rule 3, Rule 4, and Rule 1. I'm looking at Rule 3 because we want to see a G somewhere between the two M's, so that's a mention of G, the letter G. But then I'm also drawn to Rule 4 because of G, because I see that having a J happens to trigger a G next to it. But at the same time, I'm also drawn because of J to Rule 1, which tells us that we need to avoid dropping J into slot 4. So there's nothing really hard and fast here. These are just things that I'm seeing, and there's nothing really that arises to the level of a deduction, and I want to note that very clearly here. Note that not a single one of the rule interactions I mentioned are deductions or in any way a mandatory element of the game whenever we're doing a diagram. We don't have to do all of these things each and every time. What I mean by that, sure, the rules themselves are mandatory, but we're never required to see that GJ block interactions fall between the two M's. That's not something that we have to do. It's just these interactions are what I want to highlight here. I merely looked over the rules to get some sense of how some of the different parts interact with each other. And as vague and wishy-washy as it sounds, I think it's still the best way to describe it, how it might feel to try out filling in diagrams, what kind of things I want to avoid, etc. So again, it's not quite as tangible and distinct as I might feel comfortable with as an instructor, but that's exactly what it is I'm doing, just getting a feel for things. So as I've been saying all along, this is a low deduction approach. The minute you're done with the rules, just start the first question. No separate deductive stage necessary. I just want to stop here and note why this approach works, at least why I've seen it work with my students over these past 15 years. As you have no doubt experienced, some games, I would say most of them, if not all of them these days, deductions are hard to do, and we've already mentioned that, right? Deductions are hard to do for the vast majority of us, for the vast majority of games. So you can spend, a minute or two floundering around and scratching around in the dirt for deductions that just won't come. On the flip side, if you take that minute that you would spend, minute or 2 minutes, and just do questions, not only will you not be wasting those 2 minutes looking for deductions that are not going to yield themselves very easily, you will be answering questions, and so you'll be gaining points, and also in the process of answering questions, and that process I will get into in the next lesson, but in the process of answering questions without upfront deductions, you will end up finding the important deductions as you're trying to answer the questions. So it's a double, arguably triple whammy. You don't waste the time up front getting deductions, or trying to get deductions that you're not going to get. You're answering questions and you're getting points. And as you're answering the questions, you will find those deductions if you follow the approaches that I outlined. So that's why we're moving directly into questions without bothering to look for any more deductions. And again, I want to emphasize no further deductions. Not just for this situation, but pretty much any game you come across. You really, really don't have to do them. To the extent that a deduction is necessary, they will generally make themselves obvious from the rule stage. As you're writing them out, you're just going to see stuff, just like I kind of ended up seeing the GJ thing. And a note about the GJ thing, it's helpful to me, but even if you didn't see it the first time through, you're going to come across it if you are applying the rules consistently, because you will always apply Rule 0, which is J is going to show up, and then if you're checking all the rules, you're going to see, oh, I just placed a J. I got to put a G in front of it. So the quote-unquote deduction that I made there isn't really like the kind of deduction that most test prep folks out there are trying to get you to see. So yeah, deductions, I just want to emphasize again, they are not going to be necessary for this game, and they certainly are not necessary for most of the others that I've seen. To the extent that they are going to be necessary, they will generally give you some obvious ones if you are doing the rules, and even then if you don't get them. As long as you are properly applying the rules consistently each and every time, you will get everything that you will need to get. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the slide, I'm not going to actually demonstrate the questions here, as the actual mechanisms of completing questions will be the subjects of lessons 2 and 3, which will follow this one. So I did mention that those deductions that we skipped looking for here and just went into questions, those do generally make themselves apparent to the extent that they're at all helpful as you are doing questions, and so that process of doing the questions will again be the subjects of lessons 2 and 3. Lesson 2 will focus exclusively on the act of filling in diagrams, and Lesson 3 will take a slight step back and discuss the line between filling diagrams before looking at answer choices and filling in diagrams while looking at answer choices. That might sound a little weird and abstract without the context of the lesson itself, I understand, but trust me when I say that is a very important strategic question when it comes to the low deductive approach. So now I'm just going to do a summary of what we went over today, as well as review again how Lesson 2 and 3 fit into and build upon what we've discussed here. An overview of the low deduction process. We start off by reading the intro paragraph, and we note any Rule 0 conditions. So again, things that are handy to know and that we're going to consistently apply throughout our experience of the game, but it's something that's just kind of tucked into the intro paragraph without being listed separately. Next step is to start drawing a blank baseline diagram, if you can, based on what the paragraph tells you. And there is a base diagram for every single situation. Hybrids, of course, can be a little bit different. We've already gone over how you can get in touch with me if you are having trouble doing the hybrids. We're not really going to discuss it here. But yeah, draw a base diagram at this point that's blank and unfilled in. Be prepared to change it if the rules give you information that indicates that your diagram needs to be shifted a little bit. After you've drawn that base diagram, now we move into the all-important rule stage. This is where you read each rule and then visually translate each rule to the extent that it's possible or helpful, so that they reflect how the rule's data would appear in your diagram. After we've done that, note any low-hanging fruit deductions during the rule stage, but don't bother with anything beyond what is most obvious. Again, your standard should be take note of a deduction that it would take effort for you to ignore, but do not actually actively throw any effort into coming up with deductions. Don't do that. And finally, after we've done the rules and looked for any low-hanging fruit deductions, we move into the questions directly, again, without putting any actual effort into finding deductions. Now, lessons 2 and 3 will cover how to answer questions without the heavy deductive work that most other people suggest, and they're divided as follows. As I said a little while ago, lesson 2 will discuss how to actually fill in diagrams. What are you looking for? What questions are you asking yourself? What information are you incorporating, etc., etc. Lesson 3 will discuss when to stop filling in diagrams based on the questions and when to start filling in diagrams based on the answers. And again, as I said just a little while ago, that might sound a little bit weird, high concept, or abstract without the context of actually demonstrating on a question. But trust me when I say that it's a very important strategic decision that almost every single one of my students who I've taught the low deductive approach to asks me about. And we will definitely get into some pretty great detail on how that line works, on stopping diagram work based on the question and beginning diagram work based on the answer choices. And now we've reached the point where I have to pander to the algorithm. Thank you for watching. Hit like and subscribe if you want to help the channel, and leave a comment, that helps too. But the comments more so than actually helping the channel grow and whatnot. I am actually more interested in your feedback. I am not new to teaching, but I'm brand new to this whole content creation thing. I understand that I do talk a little fast. I'm not really adjusting how I talk between my one-on-one teaching and the video. Let me know if sound quality is too low. I'm using, it's true to the minimalist name, I'm using the mic that's attached to my laptop sort of webcam setup, so it's definitely not high quality. Even hearing some of the audio before I uploaded it, I could definitely hear some background noise. I did put the noise reduction filter on, both as I was recording and as I kind of went over the audio and kind of pulled it together with the video track and put this up here. But there's only so much I can do with the equipment that I have. And so yeah, let me know if something is of unbearably low quality. I can definitely look into improving that in various ways. And if anything else comes up, in particular, if you have further questions about any of the content that I explicitly said that I wasn't covering here, you can email me at shycity180@gmail.com. The email address is right on your screen there. And tutoring inquiries that you might have, if that's something that you want to do, should always be directed to that email as well. And finally, if you need practice material, I recommend only using the official LSAC materials. Again, this is not a knock against any of the other prep solutions, but I just simply like the idea that you are working with things that the test people have actually put together, and there's no extra varnish, no extra material. It can be handy sometimes to have question banks and drills and whatnot, but all being said and done, over the 15 years I've been doing this, I have just found that the good old plain Jane official prep tests are the best way to go for most people. Using one of the affiliate links that I have in the pinned comment below, one gets you directly to the test material because it's not actually organized that well on Amazon or the other places that you can find them. So I like to get directly to the exams that I need, and I do have to purchase copies for my work purposes. And two, it helps me to continue to do this. So again, I'm pretty new to the content creation game. Not pretty new, brand new. This is the very first thing that I've ever done. So this is just this is not how I pay the bills and keep the lights on, but at the same time, it would be nice if this effort could be somewhat self-supporting. So thank you if you decide to use one of my links there. And that's it. I'll see you for the next one.